I have a bowl ruff that I turned down about 2 years ago, and it's now dry and ready to be made into its final form. In the drying process, a bulge occurred on one of the sides and it began to crack around where the bulge was. The bulge isn't a big deal, that can be turned down with the bowl, but the crack is harder to fix. So what I would like to do is to cut off that bulge and rebuild a segmented piece to fit in that space that gets cut off. So the bowl will be a regular solid monolithic bowl with some sections that are segmented. Now it's a nice piece of maple and it has some nice grain, so I think it's going to look good when it's done. So to start, I'm going to smooth out the rim so that I can lay it down flat on the bandsaw. And here we are cutting off the bulge, as you can see well here. I've got a simple jig that just holds the bowl in place, and I can slide it along the bandsaw table. Now I cut off the piece at first and then realized I hadn't cut off enough to get all the way through where it had cracked. And then after the second piece, I still hadn't cut off enough, so you can see I'm resetting the jig and I'm cutting off the third piece, which now is enough. And now we'll start making the infill segmented piece. So I'm going to basically make some very flat, very precise little pieces to glue together for the segments. And this is sped up a little bit. And flat joining here and then edge joining. Planer will take care of the other side, so I'll get two perfectly parallel faces, a piece of wood. And now we're working on the cherry, and I decided this piece of cherry was so cupped and warped that I would cut it more to length and face join it and plane it afterwards. Here I'm measuring the width of the wood that I need to infill, which then just gets transferred to the table saw. Now, unlike the radial arm saw that we just saw, the table saw with a 5 horsepower motor and a thin curved, newly sharpened blade goes through this wood like butter. It's very nice. It's as though there's no wood there. You're just pushing your push stick next to the blade. So here we are at the big bandsaw, and I'm going to resaw those pieces we just cut on the table saw. As we wait here for the bandsaw to fire up, it takes about 10 seconds to get the wheels moving. Okay. So I've got a pretty makeshift fence, but it works with a featherboard. I can resaw this piece of walnut pretty easily. Plane those down and cut them into the final size pieces that we need. Now we have all of our little pieces, and we need to shuffle them together, or stack them together. And this is sped up quite a bit. And now you can see how that piece is going to fit to the bowl. Now, the planer didn't quite work as well as I'd hoped on these thinner pieces, so I'm sanding them on the disc sander to get them perfectly flat so they sit together and there won't be any gaps in the glue joint when we glue those together. And now we'll glue them together. And clamp them and tap them straight. And then this is the next day and they're all dried up. Be taken apart. The surface that meets with the bowl has to be perfectly flat. Everything else doesn't matter. It can be messy and sloppy. And the bowl has to be perfectly flat where it's been cut. And then they just need to be glued together. And a band clamp and a bar clamp seem to work great for this. Now it's all dried up. And now I'll draw the arc of where I need to cut off. I could turn it like this, but it would be difficult. Now I realized at about this point that I had a little extra. You can see I've got a little extra there. So I thought I could use that and I could actually make another slice through the bowl and infill a little thin strip of the same pattern. So I'm cutting off the extra part that I don't need for the bowl. And I sand back because it has to be perfectly flat. Now I'm going to cut a new section through the bowl. Now the bowl isn't deformed or cracked or anything at this point. I'm just doing this because it felt like it needed another piece instead of just a piece where the bulge originally was. And I can cut off the thickness of the new piece, which also gives a nice view of the blade going through the section of the bowl. This is sped up slightly, and I can just trace that shape as I have that piece, and then cut that out on the bandsaw. And this is sped up a little bit. I don't work this fast. And there it is. And then we'll sand where the bowl was cut and make it perfectly flat. And glue and clamp just as before. And the joint should be perfectly tight. It can be all sloppy and glue all over the place, but the joint is nice and tight. So now I'm going to cut off the radius of the new piece to make a round shape, which will be easier to turn on the lathe. And like I said before, this can be really sloppy and ugly at this point because we haven't gotten to the lathe to clean it up. It just needs to be, the mass of it just needs to be cut down. So I've rotated the table on the table saw so I can cut this lower piece off. And now we'll put down the lathe. And it was right at about this point that I realized when I cut that second section out, I had made my tenon too small, and I was going to have to turn the bowl around, chuck the bowl from the rim, and build a mortise in the bottom to take the chuck as I worked on the lathe. And I made a little bit of an error here, and I only used 4 of the rubber pins to hold the bowl on, and it ended up falling off 3 or 4 times in this process. So you can see when the camera moves, that's what's happening. In fact, at one point the bowl hit the camera. I was afraid I'd broken the camera. We've made our mortise. And I only have one chuck, so I have to put different jaws on it for the different functions. So here we are putting the holding jaws back on again. And that fits inside the bowl now. So now we can work on the bowl. Right now I'm just removing a lot of the mass and smoothing up the things that got glued on. Now I'll start using the scraper, and I tried a bunch of different tool rests, but my curved yellow tool rests seemed to be the best. And then the sanding started. I think I started with 80 grit by hand, and then I went to the drill and did 120, and then 180, and then 320, and then finished up by hand with 400. I had to rework the outside a little bit. Then we'll work on the bottom. So we have to put the plate clamps back on again. And lots of sanding. Now we're at the moment of truth. I'm going to pull the bowl off the chuck and see how we did. And it looks great. It's so much smaller than it was when we started. Now I'm going to put a finish on. I'm using a linseed oil and beeswax mix. And it goes on really easily, and it leaves a really nice satiny finish. It doesn't have a lot of shine when it's dry. And there we have it. Perfect.